My special guest today is Mark Sleboda. He is an international relations and security analyst. Welcome, Mark. So great to see you for the first time.
Sabrina, thanks for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be on the show. And doobie-doobie-doo.
Okay, so Mark, you're in Russia. How long have you lived in Russia, and why did you decide to move to Russia?
Okay, I've been in Russia for over 2 decades now and haven't been back to the United States since. I'm originally from Pennsylvania. I joined the Navy, U.S. military. I was in the nuclear engineering field. I did 6 years there, and when I got out, I ended up working in Boston, which is where I met my wife. My wife is a Russian citizen. She's from the Crimea. And when I first met her at a goth fetish nightclub in Boston, probably a little old. It no longer exists. I don't know if you ever heard of Man Rays, but we met there. That was more than 20 years ago now. And she was doing her MBA at Harvard and working for Gillette at the time. And we met, and she had to go back to Russia eventually. And I followed her back and restarted my life. So I went back to university to study international relations and security. We did a few years in London where I did my postgraduate studies at the LSE. And then we came right back here, and we haven't left since. So I took Russian citizenship 6 years ago already. It's a completely different world.
Wow, that is awesome. I love hearing from it. I love it when Americans do, travel abroad, obviously, but choose to live there.
Yeah,
it's just a different experience. I think everyone, if you have the opportunity to do so, should try to live in another country at least for like a year or so, if you have that opportunity.
Absolutely, it's world changing. I don't think that you can really get a perspective of the U.S., its place in the world, how the rest of the world sees the U.S., and what the U.S. does to the rest of the world until you've actually lived in the rest of the world for some time.
I agree. So a lot has happened with Russia within the past week, with Russia and Ukraine. It's just been a new headline every other day, it seems like. I want to start with the Russian warships in Cuba. So this is big news that came my way. Al Jazeera created an article about this, and they said, why are Russian warships in Cuba? Russian warships sailed into Cuba's main harbor in what appears to be a show of strength by Moscow amid heightened tensions with the U.S. So I want to get your take on this, Mark, because of course, I'm sure, as you know, mainstream media here in the U.S. Are using this as, Russia boogeyman tactic, and that Russia is going to try to destroy us all. Why do you believe the Russian warships are in Cuba, and what do you feel may have, pushed them to do this?
The Russians are coming. The Russians are coming. Oh my God! Right? No, not so much. Russia has a strategic partnership with Cuba. Right. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. They have a long-standing relationship. It even preceded Russia itself, the Soviet legacy, of course. And every year between 2013 and 2020, a Russian ship or ships visited Cuba every year. Right. There was a brief break during COVID. Last year, Russia sent a ship. It was a training ship, but a Russian Navy ship docked in Havana as well. And this year, Russia has sent a small number of ships. There's a flotilla. Oh my God, that sounds enormous. It's 2 ships. One is a nuclear submarine, the Kazan. It is a Yasin class. It is one of Russia's most advanced submarines. It is extremely stealthy. It is a guided missile a launcher. So it is, a significant piece of hardware. The other ship is a guided missile frigate, also one of Russia's most advanced, the Admiral Gorshkov. The other two ships are support ships, right? They don't even really matter, to be perfectly honest. One of them is carrying fuel for the other ships, right? Other than the nuclear powered one, but that's it. 4 ships, right? And only 2 of them really count. Now, so it's not actually some huge. It's not like the U.S. does with an entire fleet and an aircraft carrier parading up and down Russia or China's coast in what they call freedom of navigation exercises, right? Not that I heard that navigation was ever threatened to begin with, right? But that's the euphemism that is used for the U.S. to parade its big phallus military up and down other countries' coasts in the saber rattling display. This is maybe a reminder that Russia does have a navy. It's not quite the Soviet Navy in terms of power projection, but Russia does have serious long-range strike capability. The both the Kazan and the Admiral Gorshkov are capable of carrying Onyx anti-ship missiles, right? Hypersonic. They are capable of carrying Russia's new advanced Zircon hypersonic missiles, which we have seen a few times displayed in the conflict in Ukraine, and both can also fire Caliber cruise missiles, which we have seen on display many times in the conflict in Ukraine to devastating effect. So Russia has visited Cuba. It visits Cuba all the time. They may go to Venezuela as well. They did some military exercises on the way across the Atlantic, demonstrating their ability to fire some missiles, right? They arrived. They took a little patrol up around close to Key Largo in the Florida Keys, saying hi to all the folks in Miami. They went down back to Cuba. They docked in Havana. They are opening up not the sub, but the Admiral Gorshkov frigate to the Cuban people, who are evidently lining up in droves to come and see the Russian ship and so forth, waving the Russian flags, blah, blah, blah. I'm sure that's all very uncomfortable to Americans with memories of the Cuban Missile Crisis, or at least you read about it in a book sometime if you're not that old. But this is not a Cuban Missile Crisis scenario, right? This is a routine thing that Russia does, all right? I know the Americans, we've heard even U.S. officials resuscitate the old imperialist Monroe Doctrine, whereby they declare that the Western Hemisphere is America's, and that no country in the Western Hemisphere is allowed to have any type of military relationship with any other country unless the U.S. approves of it. But that kind of went out with colonialism and everything else. So Russia will continue its strategic and economic and political relationship with Cuba and Venezuela and a whole host of other countries in South America that the U.S. wishes that they didn't have. But, quid pro quo, tit for tat. And Russia has recently, President Putin has raised the specter that if the U.S. Provides long-range strike weapons and approves their use inside Russia, then certainly Russia can do the same. And they can provide long-range strike weapons to U.S. adversaries. In this case, they're not talking Cuba, probably, at least not right now. But Russia, the U.S. has some 800 to 1,000 or more military bases around the world, many of them in countries where the people there don't want them there, and the governments there don't want them there, like Syria, like Iraq, other places where they are illegal occupation forces, as the U.S. claims the Russians in Ukraine are. And, quid pro quo, tit for tat. It is, in many ways, a return to a familiar Cold War rhythm that we're seeing here, except that we're no longer in a Cold War. We're in a hot war. We are in a hot conventional war. Neither side is admitting it, but we can be honest here. The US and Russia are at war in Ukraine. Right now, it is a limited war. There are rules, and rules are routinely broken and escalated. We are on an escalation spiral in that conflict. The rules keep changing. Repeatedly, the U.S., Joe Biden, if you'll remember back in 2022, he said, we can't send tanks and jets and missiles to Ukraine because that would mean World War III. Well, as each successive escalation that the Biden administration has committed and failed to achieve the results they wanted, failed to defeat Russia, they keep escalating more and more and more. And we find themselves now, or they find themselves doing the things that they said would cause World War III. And now, of course, they're saying, oh, this won't cause World War III. But we're getting close. We're getting way too close for what should be anyone's comfort or peace of mind. And there's no sign that escalation cycle is stopping. Now, the trip to Cuba is only a small part of that, right? Like I said, Russia has been there many times before. They will continue to be there. The only thing that you could possibly say is the choice of two of Russia's most advanced ships and a demonstration of their long-range strike capability is to remind the U.S. in all of this of their strike capability. And it has to be said that while Russia is visiting Cuba, over the last week, we have seen NATO conduct very large military exercises off the coast of Russia, Baltops 24 in the Baltic Sea, which involved over 50 ships, lots of aircraft, and amongst the aircraft and the drills, there was a number of U.S. B-52 Stratofortress bombers who flew over from the United Kingdom and flew just in international airspace outside the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, which is separated from Russia by Poland and Lithuania, but still part of Russia. And they simulated a nuclear attack on Kaliningrad with B-52 bombers. So that's where we are right now. Both the United States and Russia are demonstrating their ability to bomb each other, potentially with nuclear weapons.
What is the sentiment from people in Russia, Mark, about this war? Like, how do Russian people feel? Do they feel that, Ukraine is 100% in the wrong here? Do they support this war? How do they feel?
Okay, so first of all, it has to be said there are millions of Ukrainians in Russia. Millions. My wife is from Crimea. We have family in Crimea. We have family in the Donbass, in Kharkov, and Odessa. There are millions of Ukrainians in Russia. There were millions of Ukrainians before this conflict began, not in 2022, but in 2014, when the Ukrainian government was violently and unconstitutionally overthrown in an openly U.S.-backed putsch, the Maidan putsch. So after that, and after the new regime began trying to use force to subjugate the rest of the country, namely the Russian-speaking, Russian-leaning, Russian ethnic. It's kind of a mix of things east of the country. But you have to understand that there's a huge national identity conception divide in Ukraine between what West Ukrainians think Ukrainians are and what Ukraine should be, and what Eastern Ukrainians think what Ukrainians should be and what Ukraine should be. Huge divide. And there was a kind of balance in the country, a balancing act that kept Ukraine neutral from 91 to 2014. However, that collapsed with the overthrow of the government and the attempt to wipe out all political opposition to forcing that definition of from West Ukraine onto East Ukraine, right? Or one of the things they won't tell you in the media is that over 20 political parties have been banned since 2014, 15 of them by Freedom and Democracy Zelensky on his of his own, which represents essentially all of the political voice of East Ukrainians. The three largest opposition leaders in the country have all been charged with treason by Zelensky. And one of them was traded to Russia as a prisoner of war. You trade your own citizen, you call him a traitor, and you trade him to Russia because he represents the voice of Eastern Ukrainians. All the media in the country, all critical media has been banned, and all the media in the country has been taken under the control of the regime in what they call a unified information policy. And the largest church in the country, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, has all but been declared illegal. Its churches are being seized. Its priests are being arrested. Its parishioners have been beat in the streets and beat out of the churches. It is a literal pogrom. And the reason is despite the Ukrainian Orthodox Church's claims that it is against the Russian intervention in the Ukrainian civil conflict, and so forth, the Zelensky regime believes that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the largest church in Ukraine, is not sufficiently politically loyal to his regime. And that's why they've gone about it. So that's why when you say Ukrainians, you really have to be more honest. There are tens of thousands of Ukrainians, probably over 100,000, fighting against the Kiev regime in Ukraine, against the West-backed regime. They're fighting with Russians. Many of them now identify as Russian. They've taken Russian citizenship. They voted in a referendum to join Russia. That sentiment is very high, particularly in the Donbass, but also in the south, in Kherson and Zaporozhye. My family is certainly one of those, my wife being from Crimea. But none of them regard that regime in Kiev as their government. They regard them as that putsch that the U.S. helped foist on the country and overthrew the government that they had elected back in 2010. So the Russian people know this. They know what has been happening in Ukraine because there are millions of Ukrainians in Russia, not just the new Russian citizens from these regions, but others as well. They live there, they work there, they hear firsthand what has been happening in Ukraine. They're on the TV all the time. They're on the radio, they speak at events. Everyone knows. And in Western Ukraine and Eastern Russia, there's so much intermingling. It's impossible to tell who is Russian, who is Ukrainian. Everyone has families on both sides of the border. So while in West Ukraine, there is very much part of their national identity conception that they hate Russia. That's actually probably the largest part of it. And it's real. In Eastern Ukraine, they feel exactly opposite. They feel either they are Russian or they feel that Russia is a brother people. And why are we fighting? So that is the sentiment. Russians understand this. They understand this far better. They understand the divide in Ukraine. Ukrainian society. They understand what has happened there since 2014. And you don't have to take my word for it, because all the polls that have been done, Western polls, Pew, Gallup, everything, as well as the domestic polls, the opposition polls, they all show the same thing, that Russians, to a very significant degree, 85, 86% support the Russian intervention in the Ukrainian civil conflict, the special military operation, as the government here calls it. Why? Because lots of them, they know Ukrainians. They have Ukrainians as family members. They have Ukrainians as friends. They have Ukrainians that are fighting against the regime in Kiev. They probably have some family and friends who are fighting on the other side as well, even if they disagree with them on it. This is, in many ways, a civil war. It was a civil war in Ukraine alone until Russia joined it in 2022.
Very interesting. And that brings me to the point of economics, because something else happened recently, for those who are not aware, that also concerns Russia. And this is just CNN's perspective of this, but they said new U.S. sanctions force end of dollar and euro trading on Russia's main exchange. So for those who don't know, the Moscow stock market apparently has decided to end trading the dollar and euro. I want to get your perspective about this. Do you feel that CNN here is correct, that it is those sanctions from the U.S. government that ultimately led to this decision? Or do you feel that this was actually going to happen at some point, one or the other?
Well, it was going to happen at some point, one or the other. But certainly this final severing between the use of the dollar, even in the stock exchange. Russian economy and trade has obviously largely moved away from the dollar very significantly in recent years. The numbers I've seen, that on the stock exchange, that now some 76 to 80% of trade was already conducted outside of the dollar, whether using the ruble, using the Chinese currency, using other bilateral currencies with countries. Now, this last 20% may be a little bumpy, but that is something that was already happening and now has just been speeded up. To be perfectly honest, I mean, Russia lives outside of the influence of the dollar. I can't remember when it was the last time I looked to see what the dollar ruble exchange rate was, because it just doesn't affect our lives. I know Americans were told that U.S. sanctions will destroy the Russian economy, that Jen Psaki said the ruble is rubble, blah, 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 right? And this will bring Putin to his knees. I honestly expected the effects of the sanctions to be far more significant than they were. I think the Russian government probably expected them to be more significant than they were. In fact, I know they were, because Russian officials have said as much. We actually had, when the Russian intervention began, my wife and I set out a little, private economic plan for ourselves, what we would do, things we would cut back on if we had to, substitutions we would have to make, economizing, things we would have to cut back on. That plan was never put into effect. In fact, our living standard has gone up in the last couple of years, as has most Russians. The sanctions have utterly failed. Russia had very little exposure to the U.S. economy in general, and the severing of economic relations between Europe and Russia has hurt Europe far, far more than it has Russia. I will point out to you last year that despite the sanctions, not only from the US, but all of the West, but not the rest of the world, because it's only the West. It isn't the rest of the world at all. Russia is still trading with the rest of the world with a capital R, which is the real, shall we say, international community, the real global majority. And trade has gone through the roof with China, with India, with Brazil, with Saudi Arabia, formerly considered a U.S. vassal state, many other countries. Africa, Africans, like everyone else, refuse to abide by the dictate of U.S. sanctions against Russia. No one wants to play along. And largely as a result of that, there hasn't really been any effect on the Russian economy except growth. The divorce, the decoupling of the Russian economy from the Western economy. I don't think anyone ever expected that it would go as smoothly as it has. I certainly didn't expect it. But the Russian economy grew faster than the U.S. economy last year, despite those sanctions. How do you like them apples?
It definitely backfired. And then also, too, I don't know if you heard about this, but it was recently announced that Saudi Arabia decided not to renew the petrodollar. So it's almost like a big blow to the West.
Yeah, that may be a little bit of there. If you check out the sources for that statement, it's not clear that has actually officially been done or said by anyone. So be careful with that. But quite obviously, any type of formal or informal agreement that Saudi Arabia has had to exclusively use the dollar for their trade in oil, that was obviously already over, because it was last year that Saudi Arabia proposed to China, and this was reported around the world, that, hey, you wanna conduct trade for our oil in your currency? I mean, Saudi Arabia openly asked China that. So whether that has happened or yet not, Saudi Arabia obviously already has considered that agreement is moot. So whether any official agreement that may have existed has come to an end or not, and be careful, because I don't know if that's actually true. It's obviously true regardless, right? So we have already seen that. Saudi Arabia used to be a U.S. vassal state, a pampered, treasured vassal state, but they've obviously moved quite significantly away from the U.S. One, due to the very bad personal relations between Mohammed bin Salman and Joe Biden, which are very bad, but also because when Saudi Arabia saw the U.S. weaponize its control of the global financial and economic architecture against Russia. They weaponized the dollar. They weaponized the SWIFT system. And then they went one step. They seized Russian assets. Now they're trying to use Russian assets to take out as collateral, to take out a loan to buy the Kiev regime weapons, all kinds of crazy things. But in there, they also tried to dictate the price of oil. Saudi Arabia didn't like that at all. They say all of that, and they said, this is being done to Russia now. They could do this to us or anyone else next. No, we want options. We want a multi-vector. They haven't completely removed from the United States, but obviously relations now weren't what they were a few years ago. So Saudi Arabia has joined BRICS. It's talked about joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's cooperating with China and Russia. It restored diplomatic relations with Iran, right? Crazy things. I mean, things that I never thought I would see in my lifetime have happened. And not just Saudi Arabia, by the way, but some other Arab countries like the UAE, United Arab Emirates, have followed suit. So suddenly, all of these U.S. vassal states in Middle East have effectively at least declared their independence, right? I wouldn't say they're in an adversarial stance, but they're like, yeah, we want options. And you know what? Being an equal, respected voice at a table of a multipolar world, helped ushered into being by Russia and China, that may actually look better and be better for our long-term interests than being a vassal state, even if treasured and pampered, of the United States. And I think that's where the Saudi king, prince, brat prince, but also I think generally the Saudi foreign policy elite are right now.
Very interesting. Well, there's also the G7 summit, and I want to bring this up because since we're talking about money still, the G7 leaders agree on a plan for $50 billion loan to Ukraine. This is insane for people who have not heard about this. It appears that Biden and Zelensky also signed a 10-year security agreement aimed at making Ukraine's military more self-sufficient. What do you think about this, Mark? This is absolutely, to me, I think this is absolutely ridiculous. I'm tired of us giving billions and billions of dollars to Ukraine. But ultimately, when this all ends, if this all ends, Ukraine's economy, based on what I've seen, is going to be toast.
Yeah. Okay. So Ukraine's economy is already toast. I mean, the U.S. and European taxpayers are supporting the Ukrainian government to a tune of $50 billion a year, not for the military. That's on top. That's extra stuff. Just to keep the lights on and the paychecks paid. And actually to pay for Ukrainian health insurance, by the way. I know Americans don't have health insurance because I was once one. Ukraine doesn't exactly have a great health insurance, right? Their medical system is really bad. It was already bad. Now it's worse. But it is a health insurance system that is freely available to everyone, which is something Americans don't have. So be glad, Americans, you can't have health insurance yourself, but you're paying for the Ukrainians, some Ukrainians anyway, to have it. But okay, so first of all, this security agreement, this bilateral security agreement, it's a booby prize. It's nothing, right? Okay, so it's not some type of mutual defense, NATO Article 5, you're attacked, we come to your aid type agreement. That's not what it is. It is an agreement to provide Ukraine with weapons, to provide Ukrainian troops with training, to provide Ukraine with intelligence, and to provide Ukraine with money for military reforms. Now, you might notice, you might think, well, haven't we already been doing all of that? Like for the last, certainly the last 2 years, really for the last 10 years? Yes, you have. So what's new here? Nothing, right? Nothing. One thing, this bilateral agreement is not a treaty. It's an executive decision, which means it's not permanent and the next president can get rid of it in just 6 months' notice, right? So no permanency there. It's not anything that if Trump is elected and he wants to get rid of it, which who knows, really but he certainly could. Second of all, there's no money value in any of this. None, right? And without that, all the rest of it, we're going to provide weapons to Ukraine for 10 years. How many weapons? 1, 2, right? Without any promise of money, which the Biden administration can't provide. He had to fight just to get that last tranche, which ultimately only $14 billion of it was going to Ukraine for direct military assistance. He had to fight to get that. But there's no money value to this bilateral agreement. There's nothing here. There's nothing new. There's nothing long-term. There's no money committed. There's no commitment whatsoever. This is an attaboy. It's a little gold sticker that's being stuck on Zelensky's forehead so he can go back to Ukraine and say that he got something out of this. That's it. It's nothing. With regards to this loan, okay, so let's talk about the specifics of this. Don't worry. This isn't your money. This is our money. This loan, this is Russia's in the West. When Russia intervened, the U.S. took the fairly unprecedented step of freezing $300 billion worth of Russian reserves that were held in the dollar, the euro, in Europe, weaponizing the dollar and the euro, if you will. Now they've kept that money frozen, and frozen it is in banks. It's collecting interest. So they keep talking. The U.S. is pushing to just outright steal the money and give some of it to Ukraine. But they can't agree on that. For one thing, Russia would retaliate and steal a bunch of, or appropriate, a bunch of Western assets in Russia. And there's not quite 300 billion, but there's pretty close to that. It's like 230. Secondly, Russia could also take the U.S. and other Western governments to court. Not to court in the U.S., of course, but to courts in other countries that actually play by the rules of international law that have been agreed upon, like, I don't know, Singapore or other places where, of course, all these countries have financial assets and so forth. They're afraid of that. So the scheme they've come up with is instead they're going to take the interest, just the interest right now, that is accruing and say that's not really Russians because they didn't agree to us freezing their money anyway. And they're using that interest, which is $3 or $4 billion a year, as collateral to take out a $50 billion loan. This is like some kind of dark usury occult magic here, where they're conjuring money out of nothing, right? And all of this loan is going to be on the promise that this money will be repaid. Well, how will it be repaid? Well, if they hold this Russian money frozen for the next 16 to 20 years, well, then eventually the interest alone would pay it off. If not, the Europeans would be responsible for it, because ultimately Russia, the majority of that frozen money is actually in Europe. Only less than a third of it is in the United States. And when we hear that the G7 leaders agreed to it, that's all really good. But actually, most of that money is in either Euroclear, which is in Belgium, Belgium not being a member of the G7, in case you didn't know that, and Switzerland, which is not only not a member of the G7, it's not even a member of the EU. So there is still a lot of disagreement on this issue. It may eventually be pushed through, but it's going to open up all kinds of lawsuits overseas. It's going to be a lot more trouble, I think, than it's worth. But ultimately, what this is an attempt to do is to secure more money for the Kiev regime now, in case Trump wins the election and he doesn't want to give more money for Ukraine. This is their idea of trying to Trump-proof military aid for the Kiev regime into the future. Whether it will actually finally be done or not is another question.
There have also been reports of Zelensky misusing funds that have been sent to Ukraine. I've heard stories that he bought a yacht. Meanwhile, I'm seeing videos of Ukrainian civilians being dragged off the street and thrown into vans to go fight in the war. How is this allowed?
Okay, so claims of Zelensky buying a yacht. Okay, Zelensky didn't buy a yacht, but a company that he has a large share in bought a yacht, yada, yada, yada. Was that U.S. money? No, it wasn't, right? Now, did the U.S. send Ukraine large amounts of money? Yes, of course, right? We've already talked the $50 billion a year between the U.S. and the Europeans just to keep the lights on, and has hundreds of millions, probably billions, of that money gone missing? Yes. The most recent news in Ukraine is that despite spending billions of dollars that were going to be spent on fortifications in the Kharkov region, where Russia just launched a new offensive, all of that pretty much was embezzled and no fortifications were ever built. So the corruption story in Ukraine continues. Not that I'm complaining about that, but so yes, there is still huge corruption in Ukraine. Zelensky himself, he was a comedian who had his own entertainment company. He actually made most of his money in Russia, by the way, where he made comedies in the Russian language, because that was what he spoke. He didn't even speak Ukraine at home up until this whole when he ran for president and everything. His family comes from the Russian speaking East, from Krivoy Rog, where his father actually fought in World War II against some of the same people whom he has the ideological beliefs that he has been pinning medals on. But that's another story. So with regards to the issue of conscription, right? Since 2022, Ukraine, it has been illegal for Ukrainian men between the ages of 18 and 64 to leave the country. Can't leave the country without the permission, right? Why? Because they're all liable at some point for conscription. And while millions of them have successfully fled the country, a lot of it due to that corruption, paying somewhere between $3,000 and I think the going price now is $20,000 to border officials to get out. Dozens have died trying to escape the country in the mountains of Hungary, swimming across the rivers into Romania. In the last 2 weeks, the Kiev regime started mining their border with Romania. Not because NATO Romania is a threat, but because too many of their own citizens were escaping the country who don't want to fight and die for this regime. And in order to stop them, they started erecting minefields to keep their own citizens trapped in Ukraine. They've been trying to force European countries to send back the millions of fighting age Ukrainian men who fled west rather than say east. And the Europeans are still kind of hemming and hawing on that issue. Poland is all for it. But the Kiev regime has suffered massive manpower losses, massive, right? They're heavily outgunned. Now they are outnumbered. Initially, they weren't, because Russia actually sent a very small intervention force in 2022 into the conflict, and they were caught wrong-footed. They were trying to force a political settlement, and instead, NATO doubled down and provided all this aid, and the Kiev regime started their conscription mobilization, as they called it, and things snowballed, and it took Russia a year to catch up to speed and say, "Oh, this is going to be a real fight." Huh? They were naive to think that this wasn't going to be the response, as far as I'm concerned. But now the Russian military industrial complex is outproducing not just the United States, but outproducing all of NATO put together. Don't take my word for it, because the New York Times and CNN have said the same thing. Russia, this is a war of attrition. A land-centric war of attrition fought to a very high degree with artillery, and Russia is outproducing all of NATO put together in artillery shell production by 7 times, according to the New York Times. Why? Because the U.S., you guys, the Americans spend a lot of money on the U.S. military. I was a part of it for 6 years. I know this, but the entire U.S. for-profit military-industrial complex has been geared towards fighting counterinsurgency wars of hegemony in the Middle East for the last 3 decades, or ridiculous high-end boondoggles with the corruption baked into the system, like the F-35 or the Littoral Combat Ship. They weren't geared up to produce things like artillery shells or air defense interceptor missiles or all of the type of very vital stuff that is needed for this type of conflict fought on the plains of Eurasia where it was now. Meanwhile, Russia has always been preparing for this war, because this is where the wars against Russia have always come from, whether it was Charles the Great, whether of Sweden, whether it was Napoleon, whether it was Hitler, right, or NATO. Russia has always been preparing for this war, and they were ready for it. So the Kiev regime has started suffering really atrocious casualties. They cannot conscript enough people at this point to keep up with their losses. According to the Western press, not according to me, not according to Russian propaganda, the average age of a Ukrainian soldier right now is 43 to 44.
What?
Check. I posted something. There was a photos of some of the new Ukrainian conscripts that were abducted off the press gangs roam the streets of Ukraine. There's hundreds and hundreds of videos that you alluded to on Ukrainian social media, Ukrainian Telegram channels of their people being abducted by these press gangs off the streets, beaten, whatever it takes to knock them out and seize them and take them away. Many of them are showing up at the front 3 to 4 days later. 3 to 4 days later. Civilians don't have the slightest idea how to hold a gun. Ukrainian military commanders have been complaining that they're getting people who don't know even how to use a gun. There were pictures released in the last week by the Anadolu press agency. Anadolu is of Turkish origin, but it's a NATO Western country, right? They were picked up by Getty Images as well. I posted these on my Twitter, on my Substack, on my Facebook. They're there, and some of the reports I did. Many other people have picked them up. These images, by a Western press agency, show these new Ukrainian conscripts. There's not one of them under the age of 60. Remember, the average is 43 to 44. These men look old. They look scared. They look ill. They look like they don't know what they're doing. They don't want to be there. And that is the case. Now, there still are ideological people who fight for the regime, right? The Banderite fascists, the neo-Nazis of Azov and the right sector and Kraken and Secturia and Idar and many, many, many more of these. Let's be generous and call them far-right Western Ukrainian ultra-nationalist battalions. But by and large numbers of those people have died over the last 2 years. No one is volunteering for the Kiev regime now and hasn't been for a long time. They are being forced to fight. Many of them don't want to fight. They don't want any part in this war. They don't want to fight this regime. They don't believe it's their government. They certainly don't want to die for it. And millions of Ukrainians have already fled the country, right? Millions to Russia, millions to the West, right? People who don't want to be in the situation that those poor old men find themselves in now.
Well, what's also interesting is just, why doesn't Ukraine have the same rule as a country like South Korea, where every male has to serve in the military for at least 1 year? Why don't they just have that instead of pulling people off the street? And then two, what happens when they run out of men to fight in this war?
Okay, they actually did have that rule years ago. It was removed. They simply, rather than enact that rule again, they simply politically, they trying to not create a large degree of political dissatisfaction within the population, because that was extremely unpopular. They instead relied on something that pretty much approximates. It's not a lottery system like a draft in the U.S. during the Vietnam War, but that's basically what it ends up to be, at least for the poor, right? For the poor, the middle class, those with connections, with money, right? Obviously, those people, political elites' children, for instance, they never find themselves conscripted. So if the regime that seized power in 2014 could go back to prior to 2014 and have kept that rule on the books, they would have. Russia has that, right? Everyone has to serve in the, well, I say everyone. Those going to university get an exemption. Although now that is changing and they will eventually have to do, but they have to do a year of service. That's, to create a societal thing like South Korea that you mentioned, or Israel, or Sweden or the Baltics or any number of other Western countries. But the Kiev regime didn't have it in effect when they seized power, and for whatever reason, they didn't enact it till then. And now they just find themselves so desperate for manpower that they're, again, trying to put anyone they can into the conflict between the regime and the advancing Russian and East Ukrainian. Remember, there are tens of thousands of Ukrainians fighting on the other side. Between them, they're trying to stick as many bodies, as much meat as they can. And it has to be said that American taxpayer dollars are helping them do that. Right? The press gangs, the mobilization infrastructure, it needs funds to operate. Who's paying for that? Who's paying to arm those troops once they are press ganged off the streets? West. Right. Why? Because they're fighting for U.S. interests. This is a U.S. proxy war. This is something that has been cooked up for years and years. Read, I don't know if you're familiar, or I think most of your viewers are probably familiar with Rand Corp and how important a role in political geostrategic planning that the Rand Corp does. And there was a paper, it's either 2017 or 19, I can't remember, but extending Russia, competing from advantageous ground. And Rand laid out the foreign policy of provocations and containment that the US government has followed like a checklist since then. Do this here, do this there, and provoking a conflict in Ukraine by trying to expand NATO into Ukraine, which they knew would result in a conflict. Everyone did. And so many important people in U.S. foreign policy, including the current CIA director, when he was more obvious, have written about this for years, William Burns. But also John Mearsheimer, former U.S. ambassador to Russia, John Matlock, many others have warned that extending NATO into Ukraine, first of all, would provoke civil conflict in Ukraine and would force Russia to intervene because it would be considered an unacceptable security threat. And of course, this was all facilitated by the U.S.-backed overthrow of the Ukrainian government in 2014. Before which that government had no intention of joining NATO. This is all really about U.S. hegemony. It is not about Ukrainian democracy or freedom. There certainly are Ukrainians that want to fight Russia, but that is also not all or even a majority of Ukrainians. The government was hijacked and the country was turned into a battle platform. And many Ukrainians, whether they wanted to fight Russia or not, have found themselves becoming the proxies.
Wow. Well, speaking of NATO, this also came through recently, just in NATO rejects Putin's peace proposal. So I want to play this clip really quick here. Hotspot has really been on it with covering these, particularly geopolitics. Putin offers actual path for peace for Ukraine. Russian leader presents Zelensky and his allies with a chance to end the conflict under specific terms. So I do want to share this video here.
It's not for Ukraine to withdraw forces from Ukrainian territory. It's for Russia to withdraw their forces from occupied Ukrainian land. And this proposal is a proposal that actually means that Russia should have the right to occupy even more Ukrainian land. All the 4 provinces that they claim are not Ukrainian. So this just demonstrates that this is not a proposal made in good faith.
What was that?
5. It's 5. It's 5 former regions of Ukraine, not 4. He's wrong. It's Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, Zaporozhye, and Crimea. He forgot Crimea. I guess he already considers that part of Russia.
But this is a proposal that actually means that Russia should achieve their war aims by also expecting or expecting that Ukraine should give up significantly more land than Russia has been able to occupy so far. So this is not a peace proposal. This is a proposal of more aggression, more occupation, and it demonstrates in a way that Russia's aim is to control Ukraine, and that has been the purpose of Russia since the beginning of this war, and that's a blatant violation of international law, and that's also the reason why NATO allies continue to support Ukraine.
So I want to get your take on that. It appears that Vladimir Putin is trying to offer some type of peace deal here, but of course NATO does not want that.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, this peace proposal, which means that Kiev would have to completely withdraw their troops from all parts of the 4 regions that he's mentioning in question, where they do have some troops: Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Lugansk. Some of those are pretty significant, like Kherson City and Zaporozhye City, which the Kiev regime still controls temporarily. But it also dictates that Ukraine must, formally and officially and really stop trying to join NATO, and now or in the future, and that the West must end all sanctions against Russia. Let's be honest, this is not a serious peace proposal, right? Because the Russian government, Putin, knows that the West and the Kiev regime would never accept any of these 3 terms, much less. This isn't a real peace proposal. Let's be honest. Russia doesn't want peace right now. The Kiev regime doesn't want peace right now. NATO doesn't want peace right now. The US and all the other countries of NATO don't want peace right now. No one wants peace right now. This still has a long way to go before it is irrevocably decided on the battlefield, right? Every war ends at some point with a signing of paper, or, well, that's not exactly true, because the conflict in Syria, it's not really over. It's now frozen, and there was no signing of agreement, with the U.S. still illegally militarily occupying East Syria, sitting on Syria's oil fields and wheat fields, and Turkey with 100,000 jihadis under arms still occupying North Syria. But it's kind of a 3-way frozen conflict, right? So that's probably what Ukraine will look like someday. I don't expect there to ever to really be a formal diplomatic peace agreement or armistice or anything like that. It will be an ugly frozen conflict, but it's going to go on for years, unfortunately, more than likely. None of the sides has settled things enough on the ground to force the other side to terms yet, right? I think Russia's well on the path there, and there's nothing that NATO can do at this point, short of sending hundreds of thousands of American boys and girls into conflict in Ukraine, which, by the way, I think is probably going to happen eventually. I think everything is being prepared for that at some point down the line. Not now, not next month, but maybe next year after the elections are over, or a year from now, say when Kiev itself is coming under a threat, or Odessa. But I think, look, NATO and Russia are already in direct conflict. We've had the Estonian defense minister say that it's an open secret that every member of NATO has troops on the ground in Ukraine right now fighting Russia. But they're still relatively small numbers. They're hundreds from, in general, not tens of thousands. But eventually we're going to get there. And where things are going to go from there, the slippery slope to tactical nukes, to strategic nukes, I don't want to place any bets because I don't know what would happen in such a situation. But I think the end game of this conflict is almost more certainly large scale direct conflict between NATO and Russia, even if that end game is still a year or a couple years down the road. That's unfortunate, but I think that's where we're going. I don't see not only is the U.S. not taking an exit ramp, they seem incapable of even mentally conceiving of an exit ramp. I think the U.S. believes that U.S. hegemony is on the line in this conflict. They've said it, right? They've said it previously in couched terms. U.S. global leadership is on the line. We have, or Ukraine has to win. Russia has to lose. NATO has to. If Russia wins, it would be a loss for NATO. They say that the rules-based order is on the line. We make the rules. We give the orders. That world order. Boris Johnson, the former prime minister of the UK, has actually come out and said it outright. Western hegemony is on the line. Those words exactly what I've been saying, of course, since 2022, and that's what they believe. So they can't lose to Russia. This is a world order changing conflict, and it may only be a beginning, maybe even not the beginning, maybe a middle ground of a series of conflicts, which will probably eventually include also a conflict with China and Taiwan and the South China Sea, that is going to determine the shape of world order for, decades at least into the future. It is about, as the Russian Chinese says, do we have a multipolar world order, or do we have a U.S.-led Western global hegemony? That's what's on stake there. So the U.S. can't back down. The West can't back down. And built into it is their own ideology and identity. This really malignant, supremacist ideology of American and largely now Western exceptionalism, whereby the U.S. political elite, at least, believes that the U.S. is morally, socially, and systemically superior to every other country and society on earth. Therefore, they have a duty, a right, and a duty, and the world would be better off if they were running things in the entirety. They really believe this. And if you study international relations, you come to understand that because you do all the reading. And that's the end of history, of Francis Fukuyama. That's Ike's. That's the benevolent hegemon. That's the way they view the world. And the idea that they could lose to Russia, this Nigeria with snow, as they call it, evidently an insult to both Nigeria and Russia, or a gas station, right? The problem is they have failed in their analysis of Russia, in their analysis of the global market, and certainly in their analysis of China, because the experts that teach the political elite, that tell them what to say or what they study in university or what the think tanks say, they are all to a T anti-Russian ideologues, and they have a very skewed view of Russia, of the United States, and of the world that has led them to seriously underestimate the Russian economy, the global economy, their diplomatic strength with the rest of the world, and in the Wunderwaffe Western weapons on the battlefield. They have overestimated. So this has led them into a terrible place where they can't even conceive of losing this conflict. They are, but they don't even know how to frame it in their own minds. So they have to just keep escalating and escalating and escalating. They can't even talk peace or negotiations or look for an exit ramp. And, let's be frank. It took 20 years for the U.S. to admit defeat in Afghanistan. 20 years. And they lied to the American people the entire time. The generals lied. The politicians lied. Everyone lied. The intelligence lied. They all lied to the American people for those 20 years. They're doing the same thing now. Unless something dramatically changes, Russia is going to win this conflict on the ground. It's still an ugly conflict, and they're taking losses, and they will continue to take losses. And the West, at this point, they don't have an idea of how to win this conflict. But winning and losing it's not a win. It's not a binary thing, right? It's not a win-lose. There is a whole range. What does winning mean and what does losing mean in terms of this conflict? Just like with, say, Syria. And their goal right now is simply to raise the costs for Russia, to try to force them to come of their own accord to the diplomatic table earlier on terms that would be more preferable to them, to the West, to NATO. That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. They can't raise the costs for Russia enough, because while the West sees this about their hegemony, Russia sees this as an existential security and societal also matter. So ultimately, with millions of Ukrainians in Russia, I can attest, and being married to a Crimean, that Ukraine matters more to Russia than it does to NATO. Ukraine is mostly a way of provoking and containing Russia to the U.S. That's its real utility. And if I can just give you one last little anecdote about my introduction to the complicated world of Russian-Ukrainian ethnic and social relations in Ukraine. I met my wife, Yelena, in Boston at a goth fetish nightclub, 1998, 99, something around there. And I met her there, and I started talking to her, and I heard her voice. She speaks perfect American English with a very slight accent. But I recognized the accent. I said, you're from Eastern Europe, right? Somewhere. And she said, I'm from the Crimea. And I said, oh, you're Ukrainian. And she smacked me across the face. That was my first introduction to my wife. Because, of course, she doesn't consider herself Ukrainian. The people of Crimea have never considered themselves Ukrainian. It's been a very sore spot for them for a long time. But that was back in 1998. And everything since then has been my learning about the real state of relations, between Russia and Ukraine and the whole region. And I've kind of made certainly part of that my life's work of really understanding this part of the world.
The slap heard around the world. Well, Mark Sleboda, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Not love at first sight, not love at first kiss, love at first slap.
Oh my gosh. Well, Mark, thank you so much. Where can people go to find your work?
Yeah. Okay. So, Mark Sleboda, of course, the spelling is really complicated, but I'm sure you can find it there. It is Slovak and Russian, by the way, my own ancestry, but Russian and Slovak. But you can find me on Twitter. You can find me on, I really recommend following me on either Telegram or Substack, because that's where I post the majority of my stuff. I do many news interviews, particularly with Sputnik, several times a day. I try to post at least one of those a day to my Substack. It also goes on my Telegram. I also have a YouTube channel, The Real Politic with Mark Sleboda.
Awesome. Mark, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. It's been an honor and a pleasure and fun. Thanks for having me.